Once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. This is Hazar Yildirim, Director of Strategic Alliances at AFS Intercultural Programs. We are delighted to have so many educators from around the world joining us today for our webinar on pre-departure during COVID-19 pandemic. We will be talking about online tools and activities for continued intercultural learning for your students, sharing some theory behind this, but also some key examples that you might adapt and use with your own students. Before we begin, I would like to launch a quick poll to give you some practice. We will have a couple of other polls during this session. Me and Camila are your hosts, and Camila will launch the poll right now. It should appear on your screens shortly. And we are asking, in what ways are your students engaging in intercultural experiences during and after the COVID-19? And we already see some replies coming in. A quick note for our volunteers and staff members who are tuning in through the live stream. We are sorry that you are not able to see the polls, but once we complete, we will be sharing the results and reading them out loud. So that thank you everyone for your replies. Don't worry if you haven't had a chance to reply. We will share the results of this poll in a few slides. But without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our moderator for today. Lauren Molini-Ignatios is the director of the AFS Center for Intercultural Learning and Global Competence. She will be facilitating our discussions along with our wonderful speakers. And if you have any questions, once again, please do reach out to us over the chat functionality. Camila and I will try to make sure everything runs smoothly in terms of technology. Lauren?
Thank you, Hazar, and thank you, Camila, and welcome everyone. So we just wanted to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come together today.
Before we begin, I would like to share a couple of reminders.
And support our
you
international education community
you are all on mute. You are able
quite
to
historical
use
and
the raise
times.
hand function if you would like to share
so
anything.
My name is
there is a designated Q&A
I'm
at
the
the
director
end.
of the AFS Center for
And there are
Intercultural
some
Learning and Global
interactive
Competence
polls throughout
Education,
the webinar,
which
where
is
we will
a
ask
global
you to
online
answer
resource
some
hub to make
on-screen
intercultural
comments.
learning more accessible to everyone.
But if you would like to ask any questions during any time, you're
training.
welcome to use the Q&A functionality.
So many of you
we
might
also
be
would like to
familiar
share with
with
everyone
AFS
that this
Intercultural
webinar is
Programs,
being
which is an
recorded, and
international
recordings as well
voluntary
as the
nonprofit
slides
organization
deck will
that's
be
been
shared with you
developing global
after you
citizens and
complete
equipping them with
the
essential skills for
survey,
making a positive impact in the world
evaluation
for
survey
over 100
afterwards.
years.
And finally, a
But what
warm
you might
welcome
not
to
know is
our
that
AFS
AFS
volunteers
began
and staff
as
members
a
who are tuning
volunteer
in
ambulance corps
via a
during
live
World
stream
War
on
I
our
as
workplace
a way of
intranet.
providing humanitarian service amidst a global crisis. Today, we continue to promote service during a different kind of crisis, COVID-19, by supporting students across 60 countries, finding creative ways to advance their intercultural learning in a constantly changing and ambiguous environment. So probably like many of you, now that our 7,000 students studying abroad this spring have been successfully repatriated, the main question we've been asking ourselves is, how do we ensure they continue to gain skills for engaging across difference, whether or not they go abroad in the near future? So this webinar is really designed to share ways we are redefining what it means to have an intercultural experience and how to ensure students remain engaged and gain valuable skills for navigating uncertainty and difference that are not contingent on going abroad. So we'll do this by providing research-based design strategies and online adapted tools and activities for facilitating their intercultural competence development, even in the midst of the crisis. So we hope this event is of service not just to your students, but to you as well. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. They're fabulous speakers in today's events. So we have Dr. Tara Harvey, who is the founder and chief intercultural educator at True North Intercultural. We have Carla Ray Vasquez, who is the student experience manager at AFS Intercultural Programs and co-president of ISANA New Zealand, which is an international education professional association that's based in New Zealand. And we have Molly Stern, who is our Global Competence Certificate Manager for AF Intercultural Programs. So we're very fortunate today to hear more from them, our experts throughout the session. Here's what we're going to be addressing in today's webinar. So first, we're going to be talking a bit about what we mean by pre-departure in quotes during COVID-19 and the opportunity for international education in this context of extreme uncertainty. Then we'll be providing research-based practices for designing and facilitating effective online pre-departure sessions. And we'll then share an AFS case study, how the organization is providing pre-departure support for its students. Lastly, we'll make sure we have time for our community sharing and questions. We really want this to be a space in which we all come together in the spirit of cooperation as a community of practitioners, sharing ideas and resources that support one another during this historical moment for the field and our world. So we really want to hear from you throughout the webinar, but we'll reserve a chunk of time at the end of the webinar for your sharings and questions. So Hazar, I'd like to now turn it over to you to share the results from our first poll.
Sure, thank you, Lauren. For those of you that joined a couple minutes late, at the very beginning of the session, we shared a quick poll and we asked, in what ways are your students engaging in intercultural experiences during and after the COVID-19 crisis? It seems like at least 62% are still planning to go abroad. That is a very good number to read, that many people are still interested and making plans. About 13% is practicing in a virtual exchange or virtual internship program, and about the same number practicing in an online intercultural learning. Unfortunately, it seems like there's about 12% which is not engaging, but we hope the tools and ideas we shared through this webinar will help you gain their interest as well. All right, back to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Hazar. For those wondering why this webinar is entitled Pre-Departure in Quotes During COVID-19, here's why. So what your poll results just showed is there's still a lot of uncertainty in the field of education, international education right now, for us and our students who don't know when or if they'll be able to study abroad. But what we do know is that there's a lot of valuable learning to be had as students move from the uncertainty caused by this pandemic to a state of uncertainty about whether they'll actually depart. So how can we ensure students are learning more and not less from this uncertainty? The current circumstances of COVID represent one extreme example of the VUCA reality we and our students will have to navigate post-COVID and far into the future. So what is VUCA? Probably you know something about this. It's actually a term with military origins, frequently used in the leadership and business world to describe this kind of uncontrollable and ever-changing context that we need to have skills to work and lead through in the workplace and beyond. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. One big advantage of studying abroad is that our students are engaging in constant ambiguity, uncertainty, complexity, volatility. The pandemic has changed many things, but the challenges of ambiguity and uncertainty will remain. This we know. So our task and opportunity is to ensure students are developing skills for today's VUCA workplace and world by providing well-designed, intentional online pre-departure engagement during COVID-19, which will not only equip students with valuable skills for navigating uncertainty and engaging effectively across difference, but also cultivate and sustain their interest in going abroad, even if start dates are delayed. So Carla, over to you now to share more about what students want in all of this uncertainty and how to ensure this learning is actually happening.
Thank you, Lauren. Ina mana, ina reo, ina iwi. A warm welcome to you all from the Pacific. And I don't know about you folk, but personally, when I'm dealing with VUCA, because I'm a researcher, I find a lot of comfort in statistics and data that might not be the same for you, and you might be freaked out by this chart. But I'll give you about 10 seconds to read through it and gain some insights as to what this means to you. Right, so I'm presenting you with some data from QS. You might know QS because they often present on university rankings, but actually they have recently been doing a pulse survey that has been in the field since the 14th of February, I guess when the pandemic was becoming very real to all of us. And the survey has gathered now more than 24,000 responses from prospective international students around the world. And the results have been tracking week by week over this period, and they have just finished on their April reporting. So I think what's important to notice is how quickly our world has shifted. And I was thinking to myself, you know, what a time to be managing student experience, and what a time to be in the international education sector. Basically, what the chart is showing is that student sentiment has shifted considerably since February. We can see that at the start of the survey cycle, about 60% of the students were saying that their plans were not affected by the pandemic, but by mid-March, which was only a month later, the number had fallen to 16%, with 50% of the respondents saying that their plans had been impacted in some way or other, and 34% saying that they didn't yet know if their plans would change. We see the values stabilizing as we get through to April, but by the end of April, only 10% of prospective students said that their plans had not been affected at all by the pandemic. So this is some pretty sobering statistics. And I was talking to some ministry officials yesterday here in New Zealand, and they were saying, you know, our worst case scenario in January, February is nowhere near what we're dealing with today. But I do have some good news. So if we look at what is happening in terms of what students are saying they're doing now, and if we can go to my next slide, please, Cesar. What we know is that out of those 65%, they're saying that they want to defer their study. So they're not saying they're not going to go abroad. They're saying they plan to do it later. And we have about 30% who are thinking that they will change the destination to complete that study abroad experience. Also, encouragingly, in March, it was looking like about 10% were no longer thinking of planning. But as we get through the pandemic, that number is reducing. So that's very encouraging. I think the other trend to look out for is that there's a survey by education.com that looked at higher ed students. It's got about 7,000 respondents. And out of total students, 15% are saying that they would consider studying online or starting their program abroad online. 45% of the total number of students said that if the program was offered online, they would consider it. So that's encouraging, again, for our sector. We can engage with them in different ways. And I think if we think also of our current reality of students abroad, it's important that we don't just have digital natives. We have 1.3 billion people who in the last month have been studying from home in some way or other. And so that's a huge opportunity for us to engage with them. And we thought that at this point, if you are like us, if you're an educator in the field, the chances are this time last year, you were planning on how you were going to do pre-departure, right, with the students. That's the cycle that we're in. And this is why we thought we'd address this topic. But if your world has been changed, anything like it has for us, it must be that, you know, we don't know, as Lauren said, when our students will leave or will be able to depart, and how do we engage with them? How do we retain them? And how do we keep them connected to our institutions? And then the chances are also you're looking at doing something online that you might never have done before. So you might be a very well-trained facilitator and have done a lot of face-to-face contact, but you're having to automatically change all of this material online. So we're really hoping to give you tools that quickly address this for you and that you can implement as soon as you leave this webinar. In terms of looking at that, what is encouraging as well from the research is that there are a few tools that ensure that our programs can deliver intercultural learning outcomes for our students. So I'm going to run you through those key aspects that programs need to have in order to deliver on this. And just know that we will touch on different aspects of this throughout the webinar. So the first one, which Tara is going to talk to you about in a second, is that we need targeted learning objectives and goals. And you need to be very conscious of those and how you build those into your programs. Programs need to be experiential. So you need to be, yes, high tech, but also high touch. You need to provide real learning experiences that can be applied to the student's world, not just technological tools. We want pedagogy that takes into account the heart, the body, and the head, right? So it needs to be holistic. It needs to involve students holistically. And it needs to be developmental. So you cannot give students the kind of final piece of, how cross-cultural communication happens without having given them the tools to start in their journey. And this is very important in terms of pre-departure, because we often using pre-departure to anticipate everything that's going to happen for students. And they're just not at that point. At pre-departure, our focus needs to be on self-awareness, self-development. We need intentional, well-structured interventions that happen before, during, and after. And here's a huge opportunity I see for us as educators. The fact that students are not sure of when they might leave, or the fact that they are willing to get in touch with us online, offers a huge opportunity that we have never had before. Even for AFS, normally the start of our programs was the day that our students got on a plane. The difference now is we can engage with them much well before time and start that learning, start that connection with institutions across the world well before, and prepare those students. Finally, the two key learnings that we have from the research in terms of what needs to be developed is regular reflections by skilled facilitators. So if you accomplish those, whether that is online, whether that's face-to-face, whether that's through blended learning, that will ensure that your students will receive the intercultural learning they need to make sense of the world. I am now going to demonstrate some of those principles, as we say throughout the webinar. So I'm going to hand over to you, Tara, to show how this can be done.
Thanks, Carla. So again, I'm Tara Harvey of True North Intercultural, and I want to turn now to thinking about how do we design effective online pre-departure sessions when we don't know for sure whether our students will be going abroad or not. So we're going to start off with a poll. Hazar, if you can put up the poll, I want to ask you, what is the first step to designing an effective pre-departure intercultural learning session, both online and in person? And again, for those of you who are attending via live stream, unfortunately, you won't be able to participate in the poll. But the optional responses are: create an inventory of the best tools and activities for intercultural learning and choose from that. Develop key learning objectives, identifying what you want students to gain from the session. Get students to attend the session, or other. You can share in chat if you have other responses. So we'll give we'll give you all a few minutes to respond to the poll, and then we will show the results. Hazar, when it looks like we've had the majority of people, you can end the poll. There we go. All right, so let's see what the results were. Let's see, the vast majority say develop key learning objectives, identify what you want students to gain from the session. Ding, 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 ding. You all win a free trip from AFS around the world. No, I'm just kidding. But I do appreciate that so many of you are thinking about key learning objectives first. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about why that's so important. So I do see oftentimes we immediately are thinking about activities. So even though many of us know that we need to start with the learning objectives, oftentimes we kind of get sidetracked focusing first on activities. And so I really want to encourage you to think about backward design. And this is even more important considering the uncertainty that we're facing right now. So instead of just thinking about, oh, could I do this activity online? How might I do it? Think about, what do I want to achieve in this particular program or orientation? What is it that I want students to know? What do I want them to be able to do? Or what do I want them to understand as a result of attending? And then once you've come up with those learning objectives, backward design your program around those. And it can be really helpful and really inform what you do and how you do it. For example, just planning this webinar, we had way too much information and we were thinking, what do we cut? Everything's so important. And when we focused on, well, what are the learning objectives? It became clear pretty quickly what we could cut and what needed to stay in. So when you think of your learning objectives first, it can help you get a lot of clarity around what you can do, how you might do that. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about kind of some tools that you can use to help you design effective intercultural learning objectives. So this is a chapter that I wrote in 2017. It's in a book edited by Barbara Kapler and Inga Steglitz called Learning Across Cultures. And in there, I have a whole chapter on backward designing intercultural curriculum. So I'd encourage you to check out that book. But also, I actually have a free resource on the True North Intercultural website that is an excerpt from that chapter specifically focused on how to develop intercultural learning objectives. So I believe you're getting a free resource, a handout that's accompanying this training, and that information will be on there. I'm sure Camilla or Hazar can also grab that link and put it in the chat. All right, so I'm going to hand it over now to Lauren, I believe, to talk about today's learning objectives.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. I just wanted to address here that some of you might be thinking, well, what is a learning objective? We don't want to assume that you know what we mean when we say developing knowledge, attitude, and skill-based learning. So we thought we'd share an example of sample learning objectives that I used to design today's webinar that target your knowledge, your knowledge, attitude, and strategy development. So the first is knowledge. So we want you to understand how to continue supporting students' intercultural learning during and after COVID-19 in an online format using a constructivist approach to education, which we'll explain in a moment. The affective component or learning objective is to develop awareness of intercultural competencies that can be developed through online tools and activities that prepare students to engage, collaborate, and work effectively across differences. So that awareness piece is where we're hoping maybe there's an attitude shift. And then lastly, the skills and strategies. We want you to walk away from this webinar with strategies and tools for cultivating key intercultural skills for engaging across difference. And how do we know that that we achieve these learning objectives? We'll be assessing this in our evaluation. So you're going to tell us essentially how well that we did. We hope that you tell us anyway. But one thing I want you to notice is that these KSAs, or KAS as formatted here, promote deep learning by engaging Bloom's 3 domains of learning: cognitive, affective, and behavioral, or as I like to call it, head, heart, and hand learning. What our educational institutions are really good at is transmitting the first one, knowledge. We're very good at transmitting knowledge top down, but not focusing on building the knowledge by changing the heart and the hands, or changing attitudes and behaviors. So how can we do this? One way to ensure we're engaging all 3 domains is to design our pre-departure sessions so that students are constructing their own learning. This is called a constructivist approach to education. So I'm not going to go into depth here, and we will be providing more reading on this for those interested in the free resource you'll be receiving at the end if you complete our evaluation. But essentially, a constructivist approach basically says, rather than telling students what they learned from an activity, give them the opportunity to construct and make meaning from what they've learned by integrating it with their prior experiences and knowledge. Kind of like how a painter creates a work of art from their imagination and previous experiences. This is really effective because students are more likely to retain and apply their learning to the extent that they build it themselves. So the activities we do today are going to focus on that. So Carla, now on to you to share more about facilitating effective online pre-departure intercultural learning programs.
Thank you, Lauren. And so what I will do now is show you an example of an activity that you might use right at the beginning of a session with your students. They're commonly known as icebreakers, ways to get to know your students. But the beauty of this activity in particular is that it links that purpose of people getting to know each other with intercultural learning. So what we do is we ask participants to choose an object that represents a culture that they identify with. And you ask them to bring this to your session. So you might do this ahead of time. When we are meeting face-to-face, we often get students to put the subjects down in a circle or somewhere that they can be seen by everybody, so that people may know whose object is whose. And it engages a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of discovery. And the idea is that participants explain why they chose the object and how it represents important aspects about their identity, history, or values. If you were to take this activity online, it works just as well to do a round where people show their object and talk about it, or you can divide people into smaller groups. You might do it in pairs or in small groups and then share the bigger takeaways together. I also love at the moment being very using a lot of different technology. So I don't know if you have seen it, but you can use a Padlet or create a Padlet, which is basically a dashboard where people could upload their image beforehand and talk about it. So people could read about it before coming to the session and feel like they know each other a little bit more. So I'm going to now demonstrate how a participant may talk about an object. And in this case, I've chosen an object that's very close to my heart, and is this Maori Punamo or greenstone pendant, which my husband gave to me. The reason why I chose that pendant is because it has a connection to the Maori people of New Zealand. And for Maori people, it is taonga or treasure. Punamo was the resource of the sea, and as a combination of the constellations mating with the sea. And it's a sort of fish treasure, it's often called. It is considered tapu or sacred. And what I like about it is that it's given through the generations. You cannot buy it for yourself. It must be gifted to you, and it must be blessed because it's there to protect you wherever you go, especially when you travel. So I think my husband picked that it had that connection for me to travel and land and indigeneity, which I discovered when I came here to New Zealand. But this particular pendant was carved by a Colombian jeweler. And so it speaks to my other part of identity, and the jewelry tradition, which is pre-Columbine, and that it was rich in the land of Colombia and Latin America. And I could tell you so much more about this and so much more about the meaning of it, but I think it gives you a taste of how the activity can really enrich people's lives. First of all, people love talking about themselves, so it's a great gateway into who they are. It also helps with this idea of self-discovery. It often also makes students find out more about an object that they might have had or been around for a long time, but haven't actually traced that history or that lineage. It also gets them in touch with values, beliefs, and goes beyond the surface. So I'm going to present now some of the questions that you might ask your students after you run this activity to get this insight from them. So you could ask them what surprised them about it, what they learned in general. You could also ask if they discover any commonalities with other students. And it gets to building intercultural friendship and building bridges with people. What you appreciated about somebody's story that maybe you didn't see from the surface. And then finally, what you learned about yourself. So I'm going to practice what Lauren said, and I'm going to now give you the opportunity to reflect on what were the key learnings that you took from this activity. So we're going to run a poll on this. And so I want to ask you, which intercultural competencies do you think can be developed from this activity? So is it active listening and suspending judgment? Is it about curiosity? Is it about being inquisitive, self-awareness? Go for it. I think we're going to run the poll for a few seconds. In terms of the development of the goals for this session as well, one of the key factors for me is thinking of Darla Theodorf's model of intercultural development, which says to start with the attitudes that students need to present in order to grow into behaviors and etc. And she talks about discovery, curiosity, inquisitiveness. All right, so can we see the results from that poll? Yes, that's correct. So mixed results, but really it was all of the above. So it's an activity that can do all of those things at the same time. So all of you are correct. All right, I'm just very briefly going to give you examples of other activities that you can use that achieve the same results. One of the ones you might be very familiar with is the what's in a name. So people get to share their name, why they were named that way, what does it mean behind it? Maybe there's an interesting story, a famous person. Again, you can see creates commonality, self-awareness. Another one that you might have tried face-to-face is one where you do two circles, one inside, one outside, and people have to find something common between them, something that examines emotional reactions to in-group, out-group. In a Zoom call, you could do this by going around and asking people to find things that are common to them. And finally, a favorite of mine is where you show a map and you ask participants to put a dot on first the place that they come from, and then a place that has a lot of significance for them. And participants might find that that's one and the same, or they might find that actually it's a river, it's a mountain, it's a city that speaks to their heart. So I think it takes some of that national dynamic away from it. Right, I hope that was useful to you. Now over to you, Tara, to discuss another activity.
Thanks, Carla. So the next activity that we want to talk about is called Cultural Analogies activity. And many of you are probably familiar with some analogies that are used for culture, like the iceberg analogy or the iceberg metaphor. And so this activity draws on these analogies. And this activity is talked about by Kate Berardo in the book, Building Cultural Competence. I have a little bit of my own spin on it, but want to acknowledge where it comes from. So I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the activity, and then we'll let you think about the learning objectives that this activity seeks to achieve. So if you can advance to the next slide. So first of all, you would want to share some images of things that are used as analogies for culture. These are a few examples of ones that I use. The iceberg analogy, onions are another analogy for culture, sunglasses. Another that I often use is the goldfish swimming around in a bowl, particularly when I'm working with students who are going to be going abroad. A tree is another example. So you can pull just at least 2 to 3 examples, I would say, more than one. And then you put students into smaller groups, ideally, and ask them to discuss these questions. So when I do this on Zoom, I use small group breakout rooms. You could also ask students to do this in an asynchronous way through typing in small groups. But you ask them to talk about, how is this thing like culture? What is the analogy? How are sunglasses like culture, for example? And then the second question is, how might this relate to your own experiences at home and abroad? So now that you've talked about how sunglasses are, maybe we're all wearing lenses and it impacts how you see and experience the world, like how does that actually relate to you? How does it relate to your experience on campus? How does that relate to your experience, or might it relate to your experience going abroad? So have students talk about these things in small groups, and then get together as a large group again and debrief. So when I debrief, I usually ask the small groups to report out. Tell us, how are onions like culture in your opinion? Another group, tell us how sunglasses are like culture in your opinion. What came out of those discussions? And it's important to acknowledge and validate everything that came out of those conversations. There's really no wrong answer. And I'm always surprised at the new answers and the new ways of seeing things that come out of this conversation. And then I like to sometimes tease that apart depending on what the groups talked about and offer some other insights as well. Another take on this activity is if you have time, you might ask the students to come up with their own analogies for culture. Do you agree with these analogies? Do you have any other ideas? Students could even draw or share out in some other way an image that they found that they like that represents culture to them and explain the analogy to others. So that's the activity itself. Now I want to move on to a poll and encourage you to think about what are the intercultural competencies that are developed through an activity like this. So again, if you're on live stream, unfortunately you can't participate, but the options are developing self-awareness, understanding how culture shapes identity, knowledge of other cultures, or other that you can share in the chat. So just take a minute or two and respond to the poll, and then we will report out. Okay, so I see a lot of understanding how culture shapes identity, some developing self-awareness, some knowledge of other cultures. Yeah, so this activity can help with numerous types of learning objectives. I think developing self-awareness and understanding how culture shapes identity in particular. But if we move on to the next slide, I want to dig a little bit more in depth to learning objectives. So first of all, obviously this helps people develop cultural self-awareness. Like the goldfish in the bowl, many of our students haven't even recognized their water before. They haven't really thought about themselves as a cultural being. And so this activity is a great way to get them thinking about that and to help them explore what culture even is and the role it plays in their own experiences and identity. So we might take for granted that everyone knows what culture is, but there are a ton of different definitions of culture. Some of them apply more in the intercultural field than others. And so we want to encourage people to have that conversation as opposed to just giving them a definition or worse, making an assumption that everyone's on the same page. And lastly, this can help learners consider how culture might impact their experience abroad. So if they're talking about the goldfish and realizing, oh, now I'm going to be out of my water. I wonder what that might feel like. Or the sunglasses, you know, I've worn the same lenses my whole life and everyone around me is wearing the same lenses. Now I'm going to a place where people might see things and experience things differently. What's that going to be like? So it really facilitates great conversation in that area. So I want to go on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about why this activity is particularly effective. First of all, because it is constructivist, as we talked about before. This is not about us as a teacher or a facilitator just telling people what culture is or giving them information, but it's saying, you all have culture, you all have experiences, like let's tease out that learning. What can you learn from your own experiences if we take the time to reflect on and discuss them? And so it draws on learners' own experiences, past, but also present and potentially future. Also, it invites them to share, but share at the level that they're comfortable sharing. So it gives them an opportunity to maybe be vulnerable and share something about their own past, their own experiences, but it doesn't put them on the spot and force them to do that in any way if they're not comfortable. And lastly, this activity is really relevant at home and abroad. So even if you're doing some sort of pre-departure orientation and students don't end up going abroad, this is still very applicable to the context that they're in, the intercultural context back at home, because they don't have to go abroad to necessarily be in an intercultural context. So those are some of the things that I love about and appreciate about this particular activity. And now I think Lauren is going to talk about another activity.
Thanks, Tara. That was a fantastic one. I am going to introduce another intercultural activity, and then we will have time for questions and answers at the end here. So Hazar, if you could advance the next slide. Many of you are probably familiar with the tool I'm about to introduce. For those of you who are not familiar, We'll provide more on this tool in the free resource that you'll be receiving after you complete the evaluation. But for those who do know it, I would like you to just observe how you might adapt the tool online as a pre-departure engagement tool for continued intercultural learning. So I'm going to show you an image, and I would like you to tell us something about this image in the chat box to everyone. If you could put in the chat box to everyone what comes to mind, and I will do some sharing out. So what comes to mind? Let's see. I see social disparity, danger, earthquake, white, whoa, this is going fast. Something is going on, smelling and strange, chaos, disaster tourism, privilege, earthquake again, people, mayhem, entitlement, gawking, hurricane, inappropriate tourism, red car, obliviousness, fun, privilege, women. It goes on and on. Thank you for these responses. There's so many, actually. Wow. So spectators, not helpers, oppression, social inequality, tree, different places, support during challenges, unaware, Lebanon. Okay, I'm going to stop there because there's so many that I can't read all of them. And I just want to just observe that many of you shared examples of what are considered to be interpretations. So what we think is happening based on what we're seeing. So for example, I look at this photo and I think I'm seeing rich kids taking photos of poverty, like many of you actually said. And then some of you also shared evaluations, how I feel and how I'm judging what I think is happening. So personally, when I saw this, I felt bad. And I thought it was pretty shameless that these rich kids are taking photos like it's a poverty tour, like some of you said. But few of us shared that what first came to mind were descriptions or observable facts about what we are seeing. So for example, there are 5 people in a car, sunglasses, people walking down the street. I think someone did say people, come to think of it. And that's because our brains are not wired to categorize in terms of observable facts or descriptions. Instead, our brains are wired to quickly and automatically make sense of what we're seeing by locking into a single story about what we think is happening and then making a snap judgment about how we feel about it, which is very much driven by our culturally shaped values about what is right and wrong, what is good or bad, what is acceptable and unacceptable. So we have to get really good at training our brains and our students' brains to go back to descriptions or observable facts and examine our single stories and snap judgments. So how can we do that? Well, one way to slow the brain down and expand the number of interpretations and evaluations available to us is through verification. So Hazar, if you could, yes, perfect. Thank you so much. So verification, what actions can you take to verify if your interpretations and evaluations are accurate, or expand them to include multiple perspectives? So some ways you can help your students verify are to, one, conduct research. So when I was teaching at UC Berkeley, I really encouraged my students to find credible online sources or literature that might provide historical context or insight into what they're seeing. Also, encourage your students to find a cultural informant. So someone who can provide deeper insight about the context. And even better, if they can identify multiple sources to confirm or disconfirm their assumptions about what's happening. They'll likely have different perspectives. And then ask clarifying questions to yourself. For example, what perspective might be missing here? Or ask others to provide their insight about what might be happening. So verification puts the V in the very unfortunate acronym of DIE, giving the tool its name, DIVE. So whether students train their brains to verify before evaluating or examine the source of their judgments by going back to description, because we can't always stop our judgments. Dive can be a really powerful tool for suspending judgment and expanding perspectives to include worldviews that are really different from their own. So speaking of which, I'd actually like to provide the verification of this photo because I found it fascinating. So in Lebanon, during the 2006 conflict between Israel and the Hezbollah, which is a religious and political and military group, Spencer Platt took this photo a day after the ceasefire in the southern suburbs of Beirut. So the people in the photo were among the thousands of people in Lebanon that flocked back to homes they had fled in the panic of war when the bombing first started. So this photo received the World Press Photo Award in 2006 because it challenged so many people to examine their single stories and assumptions about things like what a victim looks like, who is suffering, and the simultaneous contradictions of wartime. So we can find examples like this everywhere that are perhaps more relevant to the COVID pandemic that will get students engaged in dialogue and expanding their worldviews, even from their home. So here are a couple ideas about how you can support the application of the Dive tool for skill building in an online format. And I'm sure you all have other applications that we want to hear about in the Q&A section, but here are a couple to get us started. So one, you can, using Zoom as your platform, for example, you can show multiple images just like I did, or even a video clip. That can often work well as well. And then in pairs or small groups using breakout rooms, choose an image, have the students choose an image, and then write or talk through each stage of the DIE, having them verify the accuracy of their interpretation and evaluation using the verification strategies, and then have them challenge them to generate 3 additional interpretations and evaluations. And the other one I used a lot while teaching a global leadership course is to have students reflect on a recent misunderstanding or intercultural experience and challenge them to stay in descriptions. It's almost impossible while they're sharing, and this will help them gain new insight into how they're interpreting and evaluating that conflict or incident, and then use verification to potentially gain a new perspective on a personal issue. Okay, so now let's look at the specific intercultural competences developed from the Dive tool. So we're going to launch, I believe, our last poll. And that poll is which intercultural competencies can be developed from the online Dive tool? Questioning cultural-based assumptions, inquisitiveness, curiosity, suspending judgment, empathy, understanding things from others' perspectives, or other. And if you have other, feel free to share in chat. Okay, and then Hazar or Camilla, if you could share the results from the poll. I see some people responding in chat, all. Okay, so the majority of you said questioning culture-based assumptions. Ding, 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 ding. And then I would say 30% responded suspending judgment and empathy, understanding things from others' perspectives. Those 3 are correct, and so are all of the above. So that is the answer here. This tool, depending on how you use it, can really develop all of these competencies here. So it's a really powerful one. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it on to Molly, who's going to share an AFS case study about how they've been providing pre-departure for students and continuing to advance their intercultural learning, whether or not students depart.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. So I would like to just zoom out for just a second about pre-departure and tell you about a set of curriculum that AFS developed for its 18+ programs and now shares with universities and institutions around the world. So what AFS has built is called the Global Competence Certificate, and it's a series of online modules with videos subtitled in multiple languages, peer forum with learners from around the world, over 60 countries participants are coming from and interacting in our peer forums. And then curriculum for live facilitated dialogue sessions that are run by a certified facilitator trained by our team. We now have 2 versions of the Global Competence Certificate. We have the Global Competence Certificate at home for global competence building without having an international experience. And we have the Global Competence Study Abroad for those who will have an international experience, whether that be by actually traveling abroad or by having a virtual exchange experience in the future. So a quick snapshot of who has implemented the GCC at their institution and how. So we have partners, like I said, around the world that have used this, the set of curriculum to complement the programs that they're running, either in a study abroad or an on-campus course, or even for staff and faculty professional development. So a few examples, we have the University of St. Thomas, for instance. They are using our Global Competence Certificate, both our study abroad version and now our newest version, the GCC at home, for all their incoming freshmen, so that they're getting really well rooted in global competence learning their first year on campus. Another example is the University of Indianapolis, a course called Teaching in a Diverse Society by Dr. Terrence Harewood. He has implemented the GCC modules to go along with his course and replaced one of the textbooks that he formerly used. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So when we are talking about really identifying the learning objectives, you know, the things that Tara was really highlighting and the importance of getting those very clear before you design programs or even an online curriculum like the GCC, we have 4 main learning goals. And these really come from Dr. Michael Vanderberg, who is a key influencer in building the GCC. So the first goal is bringing your own way of behaving into awareness. And that's really what our pre-departure, we're really driving that and focusing in on that. The second goal is bringing the other's way of behaving into awareness. So really starting to think about cultural other after you've really developed your self-awareness. The third goal is managing your emotional response. So if something is surprising or different, being able to think about that, step back, observe, and being able to manage the emotions that might go with having a surprise or a cultural irritation. And then finally, being able to adapt to the other's way of framing or behaving. So really being able to bridge difference, work across difference, you know, working on international teams effectively. That type of thing is really what we are hoping our learners are getting to at the end of our curriculum. So with our pre-departure, we have a set of modules that we really recommend students or learners go through before they actually have their experience abroad. So the modules in facilitation to get really rooted, like I said, in that self-awareness and starting to get more aware of cultural other. So here are just a few of the modules that we recommend in a pre-departure phase. Me as a cultural being, stereotypes and generalizations, cultural values, communication styles, when cultures collide, and how to cope with challenges. And I should also say this is all customizable. So if this, you know, is something that you're thinking about implementing and you wanted to change the format or sequence of modules, that is something that is a possibility with our program. So right now I wanted to give you a snapshot of one of the videos that go along with the modules. So there are 18 modules in total for the GCC study abroad, and 9 of those occur during the pre-departure phase. So this is one video of the 9 modules from Me as a Cultural Being, where we're
made of is a flower. When you look at a flower, you will see that it is made up of many different petals. Together, they make up the beauty of the flower. Think of each petal as one of the identities of a person. The person's cultural and ethnic background, gender, religion and beliefs, sexual orientation, social class, etc. Each of these categories shape how the person seems and experiences the world. To explore how we can use the flower metaphor to understand identity, let's take the example of Abel. Abel is a French citizen. His first language is Creole because he's the son of Haitian immigrants. He works as a classical dancer and sees himself as middle class. Although Abel doesn't attend church very often, he identifies with the Christian belief. Abel identifies as a heterosexual male and is currently in a relationship with Claire. Abel suffers from depression, and he does not have any other known health problems. If you ask Abel what he most identifies with, he will tell you that it's being Parisian. This is just one example of an identity flower, and there are many other categories that we could explore, such as race, age, ability, education, and many more. When using the image of a flower, we have to be aware that, unlike petals of a flower, our different identities are not always as clearly separated. For example, in Abel's case, being a French citizen influences his identity as a Parisian. His parents, who are not French citizens, experience the city differently than Abel. Rather than Parisian, they would identify themselves as Haitian. Besides citizenship, the difference in age between Abel and his parents also means that they have a different experience of living in Paris. Abel enjoys having access to so many different services, as well as meeting all kinds of people in such a dynamic city.
So I wanted to show you that because that's, again, one of the videos that the students will see, and there's a forum underneath each of these videos for them to have these conversations online with learners around the world. Nazar, you can go to the next slide. And when they come to their first facilitated dialogue session, the idea and hope is that they have already participated in those 9 modules. So they come preloaded with that knowledge to have this conversation in a live format with the facilitator. And that can either be online or in person. And so what they would do is bring their identity flower to that first facilitated dialogue session and reflect on that experience of filling that out and what was surprising, what really was a meaningful part of that exercise for them, and hearing from other students and learners as well. Then there are also individual assignments built into the program. And so one of the things that is asked of students is to interview 5 people from a cultural background that is different from your own. And so they're starting to, hear from others about their experiences, whether that be in their own community or abroad, in how their identity is shaped as well. And the facilitator asked them to also talk about that experience in that first facilitated dialogue session. And that will bring me to the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to have a follow-up or answer any questions with anyone who would like more information on this program.
Okay, thank you, Molly, very much for sharing more about that example of pre-departure support for students. And we'd now like to open up the forum to you all. So what questions do you have about content, anything you've heard thus far, or what would you like to share with our international education community in terms of how you're supporting students' continued intercultural learning or during pre-departure, during COVID? So if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and Hazar will unmute you. If you don't want to speak, you can type your questions into the Q&A feature so we can track them in the order that they came in. So I'll just see if there's any questions here. Oh, it looks like Carla, there's a question about the statistics that you provided from Amber. So
yes,
are these, sorry,
I've answered Amber in the Q&A, but basically these are statistics for students all around the world, and we're students intending to go abroad. So they are, we would call them an AFS sending students or expert students, rather than looking at it from a host perspective. I think that was Amber's query.
Yes, Amber had asked, are these stats about international students going to other countries such as the US? So thank you, Carla, for answering that. It looks like Tian shared a TED Talk with all of us that touches on reflection of self-awareness and how that influences identity. So she shows this to her students often. Thank you, Tian, for sharing that. And actually, Camilla or Hazar, if you could share that, that link to make sure everyone else receives that as well in the chat. Okay, so we have a question from, I think it's maybe Jean-Marc. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is there such a thing as a short, simple, easy online intercultural course not requiring a facilitator, more of an introduction to IC than a full course? So I want to open it up to my speakers before I have a word on that, to see if you have anything that you'd like to suggest.
I'm a big voter for the Global Competence Certificate. I'm biased, but it does exactly what you are asking for, and it can be off the shelf. It caters to your needs, or you can be as involved as an organization as you need to be. And as Molly said, it's also customizable, and that if maybe there's talks, I don't know, Molly, if you can answer to that, but whether they could be list modules or the facilitated sessions can be changed.
Tara, do you want to speak to the work that you do training up folks in intercultural communication and education?
Sure, yeah. So True North Intercultural focuses on developing faculty and staff's competencies in these areas, working to help you help your students develop. And one thing I've seen through my experience is that our own intercultural competence and our own intercultural work is key to helping students develop their intercultural competence. So as far as asking about a short, simple, easy online course, there may be things out there that could help with some basic knowledge transfer. But if the true learning objective is to develop intercultural competence, it needs to be more constructivist, like we've been talking about, than simply knowledge transfer. There needs to be that heart and hands part as well as just head. So, I mean, I put videos out on the True North Intercultural website with some basic information, but none of those simple, basic, just IC videos, giving those to a student is really going to help them develop their intercultural competence. It's just going to give them some intercultural information. I wish it was that easy, but it's not. This is a very complex process.
Thanks, Tara. I knew you had something good to say on that topic. So actually, I also wanted to share that Caitlin Murphy, shout out to Caitlin, hello. She says to all of us, we've been doing a lot of returner panels with targeted questions to reflect generally on difficult situations and how to overcome it. Culture shock, giving specific examples, and then trying to help our students have specific case studies of experiences they might face. That's fantastic and a really good idea for keeping students engaged during the COVID-19 pandemic in the midst of uncertainty. That's really, this is also about helping students remain interested and then also having them reach out to other students who might go abroad in the future or just might want to learn how to engage effectively across difference and navigate uncertainty. So that's fantastic. And then we have some other questions that came in. Okay, Joy, this is a great question for our experts here. You mentioned Zoom a lot. What are other online platforms that work well for modules?
Well, any learning management system that your college or university uses can be great. I've developed things in Canva. I think we used Microsoft Teams yesterday. There are many different platforms. Again, I think the key is to focus on backward design, starting with those learning objectives. What do you want to achieve? And then in backward design, one of the steps is thinking about like, what are the known constraints? Like, what am I working with? You might be working with a certain learning management tool. And then thinking about, okay, what can we do with that? If you're not, then you might think more openly, more broadly about your learning objectives, and they could inform what tool you choose. But I think the key is to focus more on the learning objectives and less on the tool, or at least starting with the learning objectives.
That's great. Anyone else want to respond to that before we go to the other questions?
Sure, I can quickly say we have always recommended for our qualified facilitators that are delivering the live sessions that they use whatever platform makes the most sense for whichever country they're also working in. One of the things that we really like about Zoom is being able to have the call-in feature. So there are a number of other programs, GoToWebinar or Join Me, that also have a dial-in in case the internet is not working well and you want people to be able to participate and log into a live session.
Great. Thank you very much, Molly and Tara. Pablo has a question. He says, I'm very intrigued in how to structure asynchronous activities for students, including experiential constructivist learning. Do you have any insights on this?
I would say, again, you start with the learning objectives. You think about the constraints you have. If one of the constraints is most of this needs to be asynchronous, then you think about how can I get students to achieve these objectives if they're not connecting in person. And I've done a lot of asynchronous stuff with students and with faculty and staff, and you just have to think outside the box a little. So for example, you might have students watch a video to get introduced to some of these concepts, and then give them some reflection questions to reflect on how this plays out in their own life, or give them an activity where they have to go out and engage and have actual experiences where they are, and then ask them to come back together to the learning management tool or whatever that you're using to share some of their insights or respond to a specific prompt. So the 12-week program that I run called Facilitating Intercultural Learning for Faculty and Staff used to be 8 weeks, and it used to be entirely asynchronous. It's still primarily asynchronous, but we have a weekly meeting. So everybody's doing the work of watching videos, doing activities in their own time, doing all the reflection, connecting their personal experiences to these concepts and ideas. But then we're coming back online to dig into it deeper and talk about it. It used to be that they would have to get online and answer prompts in an asynchronous way, and then we would engage in conversation that way. So that's possible too. But I think starting with the learning objectives, thinking about your constraints, and then not trying to be creative and think outside the box a little in how you're going to achieve those objectives given your context is important.
Yeah, and I'll just add here, you can be really creative about simulations as well. I'm sure you've probably heard of Bafa or Freeze, for example. These are simulations essentially that explore difference and when cultures collide. And you can even put students in breakout groups and pre-assign them different cultural norms, and then have them have a conversation and have to achieve some goal, so that one person is behaving in one set of ways that's their norms and values, and the other person is behaving in the way that fits their values, and kind of simulate the culture colliding. For example, maybe like having one person look off to the side, and that's, the value of modesty. And then have that simulation, have them, hold them in that simulation for five minutes, maybe even. And then you can debrief. You can use Tiagi's debriefing cycle to explore, okay, well, how did that feel? What happened? What did you learn? How can you apply what you learned in the future? So that's just another creative way. I think the possibilities are endless here. All right, from Maral, we have, what is the ideal number of attendees in a pre-departure session to be efficient? I don't know, Carla, do you have any insight on that in terms of your pre-departure sessions with AFS?
Yeah, normally when we run them with students, we tend to say that 20 to 25 students for one facilitator is about the sweet spot, but there's quite a lot of variables to this, language, for example, being one of the key ones. If you have students who are new to a language, I would say perhaps 10, 15 will be a better number, because you're going to have to go slower, you're going to have to perhaps repeat things more. But if you have, that depends on the number of facilitators as well. You could have a session with 50 students if you have 3 or 4 facilitators, and you could divide in smaller groups when you need to. But for me personally, I like to work with about 20.
Yeah, that's always the sweet spot, right? It looks like Gerardo has a question. Thanks a lot for the information. Since Tara arrives the 3H process to become an interculturalist, I was wondering what would be the level of intercultural development, if there is one, of the QFs? Even with the right content and tools, what would be the suggested training for intercultural, I think he's saying qualified facilitators, especially for these kinds of pre-departure sessions? So I believe, Molly, that's a question for you.
Tara, remind me of the 3H process that Gerardo is referring to.
I'm not sure what the 3H process is exactly.
Okay.
And I interpreted this question to be a little bit more about, like, what does the intercultural competence level of the facilitator need to be? And that, so for those of you who are not familiar, I think of this with respect to the intercultural development continuum, which looks at the complexity with which someone experiences cultural difference. In order to effectively facilitate someone's movement along that developmental continuum, you need to at least be one orientation further along the continuum than them. And most of us think we're more interculturally developed than we are, which is not a criticism of anyone. Moving along that continuum takes a lot of intentional work. We don't just get there through having experience, just like our students don't develop their intercultural competence just by being in the vicinity of another culture. So a lot of educators are not in the ideal space necessarily to be facilitating all of their students' intercultural development. And that's why I always focus very heavily on developing our own intercultural competence at the same time that we're thinking about helping students develop theirs. And I hope I understood that question, right?
I think you nailed it. And I would just echo what you've shared, but also add on, when we're thinking about who is a facilitator for the GCC specifically, we have designed our training program so that it is not rocket science. We have a lot of STEM faculty members that go through and become a facilitator so that they can use this when they're doing a faculty-led program abroad. And we have a similar philosophy with Tara of, you need to be on this journey yourself. And, we want you to show up in that way with your students as well, that I'm also learning as I'm going through. I'm not an expert. I'm familiar with these themes and topics, but I am too a learner alongside you.
Great. And I think we have one last question before we wrap up. So Hazar, if you'd like to unmute that person so that they can share with us.
Kevin.
Hi, Kevin.
Kevin, please go ahead.
Are you there, Kevin? Maybe not, but Kevin, if you are there, feel free to jump in. In the meantime, I will just share with you that we do have free resources for you. So when you log out of this webinar, you're going to get a pop-up window to complete an evaluation. As soon as you complete that evaluation, we will email you the free recording of the webinar, as well as a free pre-departure during COVID supporting intercultural learning resource as well. That covers a lot of what we touched on today in the webinar. And then if you want to learn more about the GCC or our online pre-departure workshop for your students, you can indicate that in the evaluation as well. We do have another webinar tonight, the same one. If you want to share, please do so with colleagues on social media. We would be delighted to meet them and learn from them as well. And then we have two other webinars on May 13th, leveraging tech to support ongoing intercultural learning during COVID-19. So kind of looking at virtual exchange and looking at online learning, different ways of online learning to advance intercultural engagement. And then May 27th, a webinar on when global events expose global needs. So we just thank you for all your many contributions and just lifting up our community at a time when it's very clear that we need one another to continue to keep the field strong. So stay healthy, stay in the higher brain, and we hope to see you soon. So tune in. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As soon as you quit, a webinar evaluation form will pop up. We will appreciate if you send us your feedback, and the follow-up email will come in the next 48 hours with the resources and the recording.